Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Brotherton here, and we're going to be talking about the patterns of evolution. This is the coolest stuff in all of biology to me, and this is really what got me interested in biology and evolutionary theory, and why I went to college and studied anthropology was learning about these patterns of evolution. So on this first slide here, I have a picture of all of these different plants that live in Hawaii, and you can see that there's this huge diversity of these plants. These are all plants known that are all part of the Silver Sword Alliance, which sounds like some kind of Marvel superhero gang. But what's really cool about these is they actually all descend from one single species of tarweed that's found in California and Mexico, and they've diversified into all these different groups and species on the Hawaiian Islands. And that is a certain pattern that we see over and over and over again in evolutionary history. So what are these patterns of evolution? Well, the big ones are speciation, extinction, gradualism, punctuated equilibrium, adaptive radiation, or divergent evolution. You'll hear it called that, convergent evolution, and coevolution. So here on this slide, I actually have an example of a little bit of coevolution. This is the orchid mantis, and it looks very similar to the orchids that it lives on. And so you would think that this thing actually uses camouflage to catch its prey, but studies have shown that it actually attracts more insects than the orchids themselves. So there's something else going on there besides just the camouflage, but that's an example of coevolution. All right, so first thing, speciation. This is how we get all of that diversity that we have on life, on planet Earth. So this is the forming of new species from an existing one. So where you had one, now you have two. All right, and this usually happens by gene pools gradually separating, and they're no longer able to reproduce. That can happen in a couple different ways, but usually there's some type of isolation, and that isolation is usually due to a geographic issue. So in the case of these two different squirrels I have here, we have the Albert squirrel here on the top and the Kaibab squirrel here on the bottom. And why are there two species here? Well, because the Grand Canyon has downcut, and through time they've become separated, and so they've been able to diverge into two separate species, and they can no longer reproduce and have viable offspring. So that's the other big thing here about speciation, is that it's about viable offspring. So some things can have babies together, even though they're different species, but then their babies can't reproduce. So like a liger as an example. So a tiger and a lion can actually have a child together, a viable offspring, but that offspring itself can't then actually go on to make babies. So they're reproductively isolated, and they would never come in contact anyway because they're geographically isolated. But another form of isolation is actually behavioral, and we see this all the time with cichlids, which are a type of fish that can speciate very, very, very rapidly, and they'll go and start acting different if they're given new niches, and then they'll no longer interact with each other, even though theoretically they could. All right. Another pattern here, extinction. You're pretty familiar with this, but there's a couple different kinds. There's the gradual extinction, so the background extinction rate is what you'll hear this called, and then there can be mass extinctions, like in the case of the dinosaurs, or the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction event, or the KT event. So that's going to be due to something massive like a meteor. But actually, these extinction events, that's not even the biggest one that's ever happened. The biggest one that ever happened is actually the Permian-Triassic extinction event, where 90% of life on Earth actually died. We call that the Great Dying. So there's been 5 of these mass extinctions in the last 600 million years. And currently, we actually might be living in the 6th extinction, or what's known as the Holocene extinction, and that's currently actually being caused by human beings. Now, extinction is a part of life on Earth. These mass extinctions get more fame because they're these huge events that have killed a lot of organisms. But there's also the gradual background extinction rate, and that's just where things go extinct due to being outcompeted. And it's sad, but it also opens up new niches, and it allows for more eventual diversity of life on Earth as things take up those now empty niches. All right. So what's another pattern in evolution? The idea of gradualism. So this is slow changes accumulating in the allele frequencies over long periods of time. So this is like classic Darwinism. And the example I have here is the peppered moth, which over time in England during the Industrial Revolution, the trees were turning black due to the amount of pollution, and lighter colored moths were getting eaten at a much higher rate because they were easier to see, whereas the darker colored moths were able to blend in on the trees. And so the population gradually changed and became darker. So this is kind of like how you classically think about evolution taking place, this kind of slow accumulation of changes. And that's how Darwin kind of conceived this. However, there's nothing that says things have to change. Someone in class asked me about, well, are there things that really haven't changed that much? And the answer is yes. We call those living fossils. The coelacanth is one. The horseshoe crab is another one. These things have been the same for a long time. I think sponges have pretty much been the same for 700 million years. So gradualism doesn't have to take place. The next thing can take place, which is punctuated equilibrium. Really piggybacking off the work of Ernst Mayr by Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, and they wrote the book on this about punctuated equilibrium. And this was due to fossil records that they were getting in Cambrian-aged rocks, and that went on to be known as the Cambrian explosion, because you have this relatively long stable period where all the species look the same, and then all of a sudden you hit a certain rock strata, and boom, you have all of these new species. So what's going on here? Well, that's kind of a refutation of gradualism, that things slowly change over time. And really, in terms of geological time, these changes can happen really quickly. Okay. So the example I have on here are these hippopotamuses. And the reason for that is because their closest living ancestors, or the closest relatives right now on Earth, are actually going to be like whales and dolphins and stuff. And that might seem weird to you because these guys hang out on land, and the other cetaceans hang out in the sea. But really, in the last 60 million years or so, cetaceans have gone from being land animals to sea animals, and that transition happened incredibly fast. It happened in about less than 10 million years for a semi-aquatic animal similar to a hippopotamus to being a complete whale or dolphin. And that transition happened in 10 million years, which seems gradual and slow to us, but is actually very, very quick as far as the fossil record is concerned. Remember, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Life has been on Earth for about 4 billion years. So anyway, going to the human story side of this, some people really, really hate the idea of punctuated equilibrium and don't like it at all, even though there's really good fossil evidence for it. And so they pretty much call... It's a stupid little thing that's happened in science, but it's been described as evolution by... jerks is how people have described it. So it's a pun. And then punctuated equilibrationists, I guess if you can call them that, have described gradualists as evolution by creeps. Okay, so yes, people in science can also be petty children. All right, so what's another pattern? Adaptive radiation. This one is super, super, super cool. This is how a number of species can arise from one common ancestor. So in the example I had at the beginning with the Silver Sword Alliance, that's an example of an adaptive radiation. One species diverges and becomes many, many different species. Okay, so new environments can cause them to evolve and become different. And this leads to what is known as homologous structures. So the word homologous means same. So these things have the same structures, but different uses for those structures. So if we go back to our cetacean example, we can talk about hippos and we can talk about whales. If you look at a hippo, they're going to have hands that are not dissimilar from ours as far as the number of bones. They're obviously not going to have fingers and be able to do the things we can do, but the bone structure and everything is going to be relatively the same. That's because the ancestral mammal looked very similar to this. Okay. But if you look at a whale or a dolphin, they're also going to have those same bones. So they're going to be homologous, but instead of using a hand the way we do, or, kind of a hoof the way a hippopotamus does, they're going to be using that same structure, but using it as a flipper. So they're going to be swimming with it. So that's what a homologous structure is, and that happens from adaptive radiation. Another example of this are Darwin's famous finches. One single species of finch was in the Galapagos, and it's diverged into about 14 different species of finch. All right. And what's another type of evolution? This is a really cool one. This is convergent evolution. So in our mantis and orchid example, that was kind of an example of a little bit of convergent evolution as far as how they were shaped. Obviously very, very different animals. But better examples of convergent evolution are when unrelated species, they evolve similar characteristics because they live in very similar niches. So an example here is all of these different things. You have a bird that has a certain lineage, and guess what? It's developed wings. You have an ancestral reptile that led to flying reptiles like pterosaurs, and they also developed wings. And then you have an ancestral mammal that also developed wings in the case of a bat. So these don't share a recent common ancestor. If we go back far enough, they share the common ancestor that all Animalia share, but their last common ancestor was a long time ago, and that common ancestor didn't have wings. All of these wing developments have evolved separately, and we call those analogous structures. And that means that the structure is similar. It's not exactly the same. It doesn't have the same evolutionary history, but it has the same use. So a homologous structure, shared evolutionary history, different use. Analogous structure, different evolutionary history, same use. Okay, so if you what's cool about this is it kind of shows that there's only so many ways life can solve problems, and you see these patterns emerging where things are evolving separately in different lineages. The eye is another really good example of that. The eye has evolved many, many times throughout the history of life on Earth, and there are different versions of the eye, and they all have different efficacy at being able to see. All right. And coevolution. So this is when two organisms change in response to each other and they form specialized relationships. Hexapods like this butterfly here are a perfect example. This flower produces nectar, which is very costly for it to produce, and it gives this butterfly a source of food in exchange for the butterfly getting covered in pollen and taking that pollen and pollinating other flowers, therefore spreading the genes of this flower. So that's coevolution. Another coevolution that can happen is what's known as an evolutionary arms race, and that example I have here with this crab and this shell. So this crab wants to eat the organism inside the shell, so the shell starts to evolve in response. The ones that are harder to get into, maybe that have some spikes on them, don't get eaten, so that allele increases in the population, and we end up with crabs that slowly get bigger and bigger and bigger claws. All right. Finally, we come to sexual reproduction versus asexual reproduction. This is being evolved all the time, and it is a very good solution to a problem. So asexual reproduction is binary fission. This is where things are making clones of themselves. We've talked about that before, and they're going to be genetically identical. This is really good in stable environments that aren't changing that much, but most animals on Earth are doing sexual reproduction. Why? Because it increases genetic diversity a whole lot. And we'll talk about the physical characteristics of why that's possible, but it's through this process of meiosis where two different gametes are coming together. So that's going to be the sex cells, like a sperm and an egg, and they mix together, therefore creating a new organism. Okay. In the same way that you're kind of a combination of your mom and dad, that makes you significantly different than either of your parents. So that's really good for a changing environment. The problem with sexual reproduction is it's extremely costly. Okay, if you think about a peacock with all of its stupid elaborate feathers, or you think about the dumb things humans do, like buy expensive cars or big trucks. Okay, that's a lot of energy, but it increases diversity. All right, guys, stay curious. That's it for today.